All right, let's start off. Does anybody have a question that's pressing that they would like to ask tonight to start it off here? On here, okay. Victor.
I need to use my iPad.
That's okay.
All right, one comment and two quick questions within 15 seconds. The comment is, I read the book, Why I Left Jihad by Walid Shoebat, and was quite impressed by his analysis on future events in the Middle East. Have you read the book, his book? And the second question is, and with how much of the book do you agree with? Thank you.
So Walid Shoebat wrote Why I Left Jihad, I don't know what year, and then I had written my book, The Islamic Antichrist, and I actually wrote Islamic Antichrist in 2004. Gary, we were talking about this, and I self-published it in 2006. I put it online for free, self-published it in 2006. It was called Antichrist, Islam's Awaited Messiah. And then in 2007, Walid emailed me and said, could we co-author a book together? And he was saying basically he would sort of bring in some of his stuff, I would bring in mine, and so we did that and wrote a book called God's War on Terror. So Walid is a very strong personality. And so he would call me, we'd be working on things, and I did most of the initial writing. But when we disagreed, he would call me around dinner. Does anyone here know Walid?
How many were here when he came and spoke at our church? Yeah, he came and spoke at our church.
Let me ask you this question. I'd be like, Walid, I'm about to sit down for dinner. I know you. You don't ever agree when you're wrong. Let me ask you this question, and I would just be, if we disagree, I'm just going to go with what you go with. Because his name is on the book. It was just kind of Walid Shoebat with Joel Richardson. There's a lot of things that I disagree with Walid about. Now, that was back in 2008-9 when we wrote the book together. So there are, and I can't go through all the different things that we disagree on. In recent years, unfortunately, Walid seems to have embraced a radical form of militant Catholicism. And he and his son are just, I'll just say, just way beyond what I feel comfortable associating myself with. And there's no gospel. It's just revive the Crusades. Literally, they're saying we need to execute homosexuals, and I'm as conservative as you can get. But my if I can say this, I'll get in trouble. My take is, as I say, what you want to do in your bedroom is your business, but just know that when Jesus comes back, he's going to kill you. No, in other words, God's going to come back and judge unrighteousness. Our job is to declare what is unrighteous and call people to repentance. It's not to execute people. And he's actually calling for executing Protestant heretics. So all that to say, there's a lot that I disagree with. There's a lot that I disagreed with him even, several years ago, but far more now. So unfortunately, just, pray for him and his family. And I know, he's got a really sweet wife, and I don't know exactly what's happened. And I haven't really communicated with them in a bit. So I hope that's okay. I just divulged all that. But
another question. Saw another hand over here, right here.
What do you think about, I can understand and agree with you on why you think the Antichrist will be a Muslim, but there is great influence by the UN right now beginning in every nation. So what part do you think the UN is going to play in tribulation?
I really don't know. And here's the thing is, because of Revelation 13, where it talks about the mark of the beast, and it uses the language of every tongue, tribe, people, and nation will be forced to take a mark, and if they don't accept it, they'll be killed. And because of that, and I need to be careful about getting off track here, but because of that, Christian eschatology in the late 1800s began to merge with secular conspiracy theory about secular economic conspiracy theory that had to do with Illuminati and the Masons and all this kind of stuff. And to where now it's just commonly assumed within the church that the New World Order and all this kind of stuff is central to the Bible. But the fact of the matter is that when you separate popular Christian end-time theory from the Scriptures, there's very little in the Bible that says anything about a New World Order. When I look at the overwhelming emphasis of the Scriptures, I see the Antichrist leading a 10-nation coalition. Over and over and over again. I want to say about 8 or 9 times, it refers to his empire as 10 nations. Now, because of that language, people go, but it's going to be global, every single last nation. The problem is you have probably 6 or 7 other passages that you could go to right off the top. You know, in the days of Caesar Augustus, a decree went out into all the world that a census should be taken. Did it go out to all the world? It went out to the Roman Empire. It was the Roman Empire. You have multiple passages in Daniel where it says that Cyrus, or Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, he says, "You, O king, are the king of kings." At one point he says, "Wherever birds of the air or beasts of the field dwell, God has made you king over them all." Did Nebuchadnezzar rule the entire planet? No, he didn't literally. So we need to understand that I take the Bible literally, but I understand that the Bible is filled with expressions. It's in the same way that you and I have conversations. You know, we have expressions that we use. The Bible frequently, particularly in Eastern language, uses a lot of hyperbole. And so you actually have one statement that talks about the Persian Empire, and it had authority over every tongue, tribe, and people. It's almost the exact equivalent of what's in Revelation. So then when you look at other passages that say, it says in Daniel 11, the Antichrist will conquer many nations. And then it says, but these will escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the sons of Ammon. So here you have some, which is probably referring to Jordan. It says, escape his hand. It says in Daniel 9:27, wars are decreed until the end. It's talking about the Antichrist, and it says, wars are decreed until the end. If there are wars, that means there are resistor militaries, and there are resistor governments, and thus resistor nations. It says of the Antichrist that news from the north and the east will alarm him, and then he strikes out in rage to destroy and annihilate many nations. I think there are going to be resistor nations. And so I see evidence that this thing is not going to be completely a global New World Order government. I think it's going to be a massive regional empire that has, you know, again, if it's a religion, then it has global implications. Its fingers are everywhere, but it doesn't mean he's going to control every government. Now, he may, but personally, whenever it talks about it used the Greek words for the control of the Antichrist, it uses words like gay and like, you know, terra, and the words that refer to the land or the region. But the only time that it uses the word in Greek, which means all of the planet, is cosmos, and that's when it refers to the rule of Christ. I believe that only Jesus is going to rule the cosmos, the whole planet. I believe the Antichrist is going to try, but I don't believe he's actually going to fully succeed. Now, again, he may. We need to be prepared for that. But all that to say is, I don't see as much of a new world order as a lot of that, you know, prophecy world maybe sees. And so as far as the UN goes, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. But what I see when I look at the system of the Antichrist, I see a religious system. I see an economic system, but it's also a religious system. It's much more than just this weak. The system of the Antichrist is referred to as the iron-toothed beast. You don't refer to an entity as iron-toothed. That, you know, what does the UN do when something goes bad? We declare that we condemn this. Ooh, don't condemn us again. You know, joint declarations of condemnation. You know, and the Islamic world goes, oh no. And they go, well, we're going to do it again. They're like, please don't. It's like the most toothless grouping of, you know, nations that you've ever seen. So, anyway, I hope that answers somewhat where I'm coming from. I don't know if I'm right or not, but that's just my approach.
So what about the U.S.? Because we look at the U.S. and we see it's going down, down, down from what it used to be. And in my mind, I correlate it with the end times and what's going on in the Middle East. We don't have the influence we did. We're not even friends as we should be, as
With
much
Israel.
as we should be with Israel, yes.
Right.
So,
For what it's worth, I do have a DVD out there where I took almost 2 hours to deal with where is the U.S. in Bible prophecy. And here's what I would say is, I would approach that this way, is I don't personally believe that we'll ever see the United States, as we saw it when we were kids. I don't think we'll ever get back to that. However, I hear a lot of prophecy teachers, and what they say is they look at the Bible and they say, America is not prominent in end-time prophecy. Therefore, we can conclude this: something happens. Something happens and we get taken out. I hear this from numerous prophecies. We get taken out. Or sometimes they say we literally get destroyed, removed. And in my opinion, that is a huge, glaring assumption. It's a huge assumption, and I think it's a major error. I think the fact that the Bible is not about us is enough to account for the fact that we are not central to the end-time story. Secondly, I would say that we are already diminished enough that we're not primarily the main players in the Middle East. We're already there. Now, what's going to happen to this country between now and the return of Jesus? I have no idea. But here's what I do know, is that we are called to be intercessors. We're not called to be pessimists and say, well, it's all going to hell in a handbasket anyway, so hands off. One of the biggest danger of Bible prophecy is to have an assumption and then take a fatalistic, deterministic, passive approach. Now, I look at the story of Moses, and God comes to Moses. He says, Moses, get out of my way. I'm going to destroy that people. Now, if God said that to me, I'd be like, yes, sir. You're God. I'm not. Right? Destroy them. God says, I'm just going to make a new people through you, Moses, because I'm sick of them. And Moses stands and he says, not so, Lord, but for your good name's sake, be merciful to your people. Let your name be seen as merciful. And he interceded, and God actually went with Moses. We're called to be prayer warriors. And if your spouse, somebody gets sick, they have cancer, you don't go, well, they're done. You pray, you get on your knees, and you cry out in prayer until they are in the ground. And some people, go another week or so. You pray until it's a done deal. And we as Americans, this is our sphere of influence. I'm raising my kids here. You're called to pray for Chattanooga. You're called to pray for Tennessee and this region. You're called to pray for the United States. And we don't give up the fight until it's gone. And I think all of this foregone conclusions that we're going to get wiped out is dangerous, and I think it's irresponsible. Based on the scriptural information we have, I think it's irresponsible. I think we're called to fight and pray for our nation until the very bitter end. And I want to go down with my boots on as far as that's concerned. And I think God will honor that. Because nowhere did he ever say, the Bible lays out a lot of the details of the end times. It gives us sort of the framework, the skeleton, but it doesn't fill in all the details. And we need to be very careful of making assumptions and filling in the details. We need to say, God, I believe that you're good and you're merciful. I hear a lot of people say this, and then I'll finish this. I hear a lot of preachers say, if God doesn't judge America, he's going to owe Sodom and Gomorrah a big apology. And, well, first of all, when I look at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, what I see is, he comes before the Lord and he says, Lord, if I can find 10 righteous, will you have mercy? And he says, yeah, if you can find 10, I'll spare it. And I think we've got 10. Can I get it? I think we've got at least 10. And, I think what happens with Christians is we groan at what we see unfolding in the United States, and then we say, if I was God, I would judge this nation, and then we get angry when God doesn't. It's like Christians are actually wanting God to, and talking with Pastor on the way over here. Like, I'm a doctrine guy. I believe doctrine is important. But, I speak in a wide range of cultures and church cultures. And believe me, when I first got saved, I had no grid for Christian church culture. I had no grid for it. I used to open the yellow pages and I would call numbers. I'd be like, hello, Church of God of Prophecy? Do you guys have meetings tonight? Yes, sir. Can I come? Like, I would just show up at some of the weirdest things. Like, there's a lot of weird stuff out there. And some of them have crazy doctrine. But you know something? God blesses people. And I guess what I'm saying is he's actually a lot more merciful and patient than we often are ourselves. And so I personally believe that God wants to pour out revival on this nation, pour out a revival of repentance. I'm praying for that, and I'm contending for that. And I think we need to be contending for that as well. So.
I know that the Jewish nation is God's favorite people. During the tribulation, the Jews that are left, obviously they still will have a choice on making a decision. Will they be forced into submission? Will they still have a choice to deny Christ? Or must they bow the knee and accept him where they want to at the very last moment?
Well, the bottom line is no one is entering the kingdom other than through faith in Jesus, the Messiah, Yeshua, the Messiah. No one. Being Jewish doesn't give you any special pass. There's not two covenants, there's one. In terms of the new covenant, there's only one way to receive a new heart and a new spirit, and that's through the blood of Jesus. And that's another example, by the way. Whoever takes the mark of the beast goes to hell. Well, Israel is unbelieving. The majority of Israel is unbelieving throughout the tribulation. And yet, when they return, Zechariah 12, they will look upon, when Jesus returns, Zechariah 12, they will look upon, the ones that are left, the remnant, will look upon the one they have pierced. And it says that he will pour out upon them a spirit of grace and supplication. And they will weep as one mourns for an only child. They will mourn as one mourns for an only child and weep. And so the gift of repentance is given to them. And they come to recognize Messiah as he returns, their Messiah as he returns. Now, they don't take the mark of the beast. So there's another nation that is not in submission to the Antichrist, right? So there's another example of something outside of this sort of, sometimes we paint it in these stark black and white, either you're for the Antichrist or not. Personally, I think you're going to get a whole lot of folks, especially in the South, and they're going to be kind of like, I ain't taking no mark of the beast. You know what I'm saying? And they might not even be Christians. I think there's going to be a lot of resistors all throughout the earth, but in pockets and so forth, But hey, I'll tell you the story real quick. I was visiting with my aunt. God bless my aunt. She's been married like 35 times or something. But anyway, this was one of her husbands somewhere along the line. I can't remember what his name was. It was like Booger or Catfish or something. And so they lived in Ocala, right on the edge of the national forest. And they had their single wide, maybe it was a double wide, but they had this huge yard, and he had like 35 hunting dogs. And I was there as a young guy, and he would drive around the yard in his truck and feed the dogs in the morning. That's a lot of dogs to feed. And I remember it was like 9 a.m, and he was already drunk. He was like stumbling drunk. And I was a new believer, and he had this tract on his dashboard, and it said something about the mark of the beast. And I was like, oh, and I thought, open door to try to witness to him, and I said something like, oh, and here he is, he's drunk, and he comes over, and he kind of stumbles, he says, hey, I tell you what, I ain't gonna take no mark of the beast. And I was like thinking, well, great for you, bud. Like, you're right on target, and that's the thing, is sometimes we think like, oh, well, the mark of the beast is something like, if we don't take that, we're okay. You're drunk at 9 a.m. I mean, you've essentially already taken it. I mean, not really the mark of the beast, but do you know what I'm saying? Like, I think it's just kind of weird the way that we sometimes, view that. There's some pre-existing conditions, like, before you need to worry about the mark of the beast. But anyway, back to Israel is the time of Jacob's trouble, Israel, is one of the biggest issues theologically that much of the church has not wrestled with. Because when you look at Jeremiah 30, he says, can a man have a child? And the answer is supposed to be no. Nowadays, there's a few strange exceptions, I guess. I don't know how that works. But can a man have a child? No. And so he says, well, then why do I see every man with his hands on his loins like a woman who's in birth? Their faces are pale. And he says, behold, it is the time of Jacob's distress or Jacob's trouble. And then it says, there is no day like it. So it's an unparalleled day. That day is great. There is none like it. So it introduces the concept of Jacob's trouble. Then in Daniel 12, the angel Gabriel, who just laid out the activity of the Antichrist in chapter 11, and then he says, at that time, Michael the archangel will rise up, who is, over your people, and there will be a time of distress such as has never happened since there was a nation until that time. And so he speaks of the same period of unparalleled distress and tribulation. Now in Jeremiah, he says, it will be the time of Jacob's trouble, but they will be rescued out of it. So there's that catch, but they will be rescued out of it. Then in Daniel, he says, at that time, all of your people, those whose names are written in the book of life, they will be rescued. But how are they rescued? They're rescued by the resurrection, by the return of the Messiah. Jesus then quotes this in Matthew 24 in his sermon on the end times, the Olivet Discourse. He talks about a time of unparalleled distress, such as has never happened, and then he calls it the Great Tribulation. The point is this. He very clearly, Jesus and Gabriel clearly say that in the context of this final period, there's a time of distress such as has never happened before. And what that means, if we are to take those words, which they seem to be pretty adamant and clear, that this is unparalleled, there's never been a distress like this, is that something worse than the Holocaust is coming. And by and large, as the church, we kind of look at German church and we go, oh, man, they failed. They blew it. A couple people, Corrie ten Boom, there were some that were doing it right, Bonhoeffer. But by and large, most of the church failed. But by and large, we know that it's coming and we're doing nothing about it whatsoever. And, we can say, well, we're going to be raptured out beforehand or whatever. There's some of those issues. But the bottom line is all the evidence in the nations right now is that, the rhetoric throughout the world against the Jewish people right now is forget it, it's 100 times worse than anything that was being said before World War II. Things before World War II, they were said mostly behind closed doors, and then we have the Holocaust. Now it's openly being declared throughout the Islamic world, multiple nations, throughout Europe. Once again, we have the evidence from the scriptures that something is coming. We have recent history that testifies what mankind is capable of, and we're pretty much not even wrestling with that as a theological issue. If we knew with clarity, for instance, that Rwanda was about to have a genocide, we would be mobilizing, the missions movement, and doing everything we could to be there and to be involved and to stand. But by and large, with Israel, we're just kind of like, well, something terrible is coming for them, but we're not really doing anything about it. We're not trying to, anything. And so the time that's coming for the Jewish people is severe. And, whether, we're raptured out or not, there will be Christians, there will be, tribulation saints that will be alive. And I believe that those that are alive at the time will be called to stand with the Jewish people in that time, in the same way that Corrie ten Boom and her family laid down their lives to risk everything to try to rescue God's covenant people. And the reality is that when you lay down your life for someone, anybody, how many people here have done ministry to the poor, been involved in ministry to the poor to some degree? It's like, you do something, you make some sacrifice, and, you give someone a meal, and they're like, what? Green beans? I don't like green beans. You're like, you ungrateful jerk, you know what I mean? Like, you're like, you know, but that's the reality is when you lay down your life for unbelievers, it's not going to be all, you know, rosy and nice. It's going to be a gruesome, horrific, the days ahead for those that are really engaged in the gospel. It's going to be hard, toil, labor, whether it's for the Jewish people or otherwise. So anyway, I just talked in circles. I don't know if I even answered your question, but everybody has to come through the gate of Jesus. There's no other way.
Someone else? Right here.
I have a question that's a little confusing for some of us. When you say Jewish people, are you including all the tribes of Israel? Because there's at least the people that I speak with, and to me, myself, to a degree, there's some confusion because the houses were divided. They were divided by, I wouldn't say by God's hand, but let's just say it was set up that way. There was the 10 tribes, and there was Benjamin, and there was Judah.
Yeah.
One went in exile first, and then the other. And now when people say Jewish, they think of Judah. But there are 12 total tribes.
Right.
And so and throughout the whole Bible, it gives different prophecies for the house of Judah and the house of Israel. And I believe the prophecy about beauty and bonds, the two different names, the stick that's broke and then comes
Ezekiel
back
37.
together. Is that dealing with the two houses?
Okay, so
Because who's going to be persecuted? Is it just going to be over in the land of Israel? And if you don't know who all the Jewish are, you're not watching for that.
okay. So okay, so let me just give a little biblical background first. So when the Assyrian exile took place, the northern nation of Israel was exiled, and you had the 10 tribes that were dispersed, and that's often called Ephraim. Sometimes in the Bible it'll refer to it as Ephraim or Joseph. And then in the south you had Judah and Benjamin. And so a lot of people will say that the 10 tribes were lost. That's not true. The 10 tribes were not lost. Even in the New Testament, you had Anna's waiting for the Messiah in the temple daily, and it says she was from the tribe of Asher. And you have multiple, references even in the New Testament to people that were from some of these so allegedly lost tribes. So the idea that the tribes are lost is not true. Now, what you have in modern times is a movement called the two-house movement. And so what the two-house movement essentially says, and this began with a book by Barry and Batia Wooten, and as well as another guy co-authored it down in Florida named Moishe Koinakowski. His real name is Marvin, but he goes by Moishe. And they wrote a book essentially saying that if you're a Christian throughout the earth, the reason that you're a Christian is because you're actually one of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And that you are Israel, that all Christians are Israel. So historically, there's just huge problems with that. Moishe, by the way, ended up embracing polygamy and concubines and just all kinds of, and slavery, literally saying, well, slavery's biblical and so forth. But so here's the thing, is biblically, throughout much of the Old Testament, you have references to both. It'll refer to Ephraim and Judah and this sort of thing, and sort of view them as separate. By the time of the New Testament, when it uses the term Jew, it's not just referring to Judah, it's referring to the inhabitants of Judah. You could have been from one of the 10 tribes, but if you're in Judah, you were just called a Jew. And so in the Bible, just like today, words develop and evolve and have meaning. You could look at the word like Yavan. Well, in the earlier portions of Scripture, Yavan, it's always translated as Greece, by the way. Yavan was a region that included modern-day Greece. It also included a bit of Western Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Well, eventually, when Alexander then swept across the whole Middle East was referred to as Yavan. But in the most specific sense, it's actually Western Turkey, and Greece. But then we translate it as Greece, and we think modern Greece. And so words evolve, and they have different meanings. In the same way, the Bible actually begins using the term Judah to refer to the two southern tribes, the southern kingdom. But then by the time of the New Testament, it actually has different meaning. And you can, show that it had different meaning. Now, Ezekiel 37 speaks of, in the eschatological sense, the two sticks of Ephraim and Judah being united. And clearly, many of the Jews, the Israelis, the Jews today, they don't necessarily know what tribe they're from. But the thing of it is the problem with the whole two-house thing is it's basically kind of like a weird messianic Calvinism. So it's basically saying, like, if you're a Christian, that the reason that God called you is because you're ethnically Jewish. You have blood. The bottom line is the history of the world is one big intermixed mess. I have Lithuanian, Latvian, German, Polish, Portuguese, and some Irish. And as I joked earlier, I think I'm thinking some Dachshund. It might be Welsh Corgi. I haven't figured it out, but I don't have any Welsh in me. It's because what Gary and I were talking about is all this genetic manipulation that the government's doing to me. I was watching this. Where's Pastor Squirrel? I was watching this cartoon called King of the Hill. Have you guys ever seen that? It's kind of, and Bill. So you've got these guys, like they're from Texas, these friends, and they're always like out in the alley drinking beer, and they're friends. And there's one guy, Bill. He's sort of like the divorced, overweight, bald, depressed friend that lives next door, and he was in the army his whole life. Well, the conspiracy theory friend convinces Bill that he was part of this army experiment called Operation Infinite Walrus, where the army genetically manipulated soldiers so that they would be extra fat and hairy, so they could swim under the ice to infiltrate the enemy. And so Bill is very upset with the army because they did this to him, and he's standing in front of the mirror, like in his skivvies, and he's probably like a 50, 60-year-old guy, and he goes, "Mama, look what they did to your baby!" And then he comes to find out he was not part of the program. So it was just, anyway, it pops in my head, what the government is doing to us. But anyway, all that to say is the two-house movement, it's fraught with historical and theological problems. The Lord will bring together those that are Jewish. But the bottom line is because what this whole theory does is it basically says there's no such thing as believing Gentiles. Because the whole movement is intended to try to say that every Christian, whether you know it or not, is actually one of the lost Israelites. And then they say you have to be Torah observant. You have to keep the law. That's basically what the movement is saying. And so it becomes a weird version of modern Judaism. And it's similar to the old Anglo-Israelism, that whole British Israel that says the British are the British, the covenant people, and that the United States, we're actually the lost in the United States, and the British are the lost tribes of Israel. It's a modern version of that. And so let me just say this. Dan Juster and what's his name, Resnick, they have a very thorough theological article. They have a short version, a simplified version, a much longer version called The Ephraimite Error that is on the MJA website, Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, on their website. If you just Google The Ephraimite Error, they deal with many of the theological problems of the two-house movement. The Lord is going to reunite all of his people eschatologically. At the time of the Messiah, there will be no question about which tribe belongs to which. But all of this, the reason I was saying I'm all these ethnicities is, maybe I have one 332nd percentage of some Gad in me, and then another 132nd of Ephraim, and then maybe I've got a whopping 10% of Levite in me or something. Like maybe I do, but something, I was raised a Gentile, And I believe that based on my reading of the New Testament, that I'm supposed to live as a Gentile, and that my mandate is not to keep Torah. Acts 15 was pretty clear about that. That, I, as a Gentile, I'm not called to keep Torah. If I want to celebrate the festivals, that's wonderful. I think that's great, but it's certainly not mandatory. And so I don't even know if, some of your friends that you're talking to, but I spoke some years ago at an event I was invited where a lot of these guys were speaking, and I didn't even know what I was getting into when I got there. And the organizer of the event sent out an email beforehand, and he actually said, now I want you guys, all you speakers, to be aware, many Christians will be coming to this event. Make sure you evangelize them. The movement is primarily geared toward evangelizing Christians to Torah observance. It's not primarily about winning lost to Jesus. It really becomes Torah-dolatry, if you will. And I talk to a lot of these folks, and it's Torah, 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 Torah. And I'm like, Torah, 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 Jesus. And I go, I tend to prefer hanging around folks that are Jesus, 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 Jesus. And so there's just, this thing is spreading like wildfire, by the way, as a movement. And they can be really aggressive and forceful. And they exploit the lack of Christian knowledge on some of these Old Testament issues, and it can be confusing. But that article is very helpful. The Ephraimite Era, Dr. Michael Brown has written some stuff on it as well in one of his books called Can a Jew Really Believe in Jesus, or something like that. And there's a few other things out there. But anyway, hope that was helpful as well.
What can you tell us about the emergence of Chrislam?
Okay, so Chrislam is, it's a term that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But think of a spectrum where on one side you have things that I would embrace and say we should do. So when Hudson Taylor went to go preach to, inland China, he embraced many of the cultural traditions of mainland China. He dressed like them. He was accommodating their culture so as to reach them, right? Every missionary is going to contextualize to a degree because we're not spreading Americanism abroad. Now there's some things that we draw the line on, such as, well, the natives don't wear clothes. We're going to try to teach them to cover up a little bit, and that sort of thing. But we're not here to say, but, you have to wear a suit and tie or what, although we generally do tend to do that a lot. But so on one side, there is cultural contextualizing the gospel. On the other side is full-blown syncretism, where you've combined two religions. You've combined Christianity with a false religion. And there are many, many different lines along the way. And so you've got a few things happening. You have sort of just the spirit of the age that is infecting much of the church. And what is the religion of our age right now? What is the religion of our time? It's cultural and moral relativity. It's religious pluralism. All religions are equally valid or equally invalid, but they're all the same, basically. And if you say, our religion is true, no one comes to the Father but through Jesus, you're a blasphemer to the religion of the age, right? And so, unfortunately, the church often begins to embrace the spirit of the age a little bit. A little bit. They don't think they are, but it's kind of that frog being cooked in the kettle slowly. And so you have some, in some portions of the church, that they basically start accommodating elements of other faiths. And, you kind of have the more liberal churches that'll say, hey, well, the Muslims, they're renting the building next door, but they had a flood, and so we're just going to welcome them into the church to have their worship services and to be good neighbors. And you go, well, I believe in being good neighbors, but I don't believe in accommodating false worship in the church, right? But they go, but this is just okay. So there's a lot of like little fine lines along the way. So there's that whole, if I can just say it, and I don't want to, but there's that whole kind of Rick Warren approach, which is, I just think he blurs the lines a lot. His desire, I think, is to reach people to God. I really think he has a good heart, but I just think sometimes he does it in ignorance. He does things in ignorance. Some of the things that he does, like let me try to articulate it this way. Okay, so the United States is a country where we have as the foundation of who we are, give us your tired, poor, huddled masses yearning to breathe free, right? We are a melting pot. We are a country of tolerance. Tolerance is a really good principle. It's a good concept. But tolerance, in terms of the hierarchy of good principles, it has to be subordinated to civil liberties, to freedom, to equality. When you take civil liberties, equality, and all of these things, and you put tolerance above them, it becomes suicidal. Because you tolerate that which is hyper intolerant. It's like if I say, I'll eat anything. I'll eat anything. And then someone hands you a bottle of antifreeze. And you're like, oh, but that's poison. And then you said, but you said you'll eat anything. And this is the conundrum of the modern spirit of the age, that, religious pluralism, is they say, well, we're tolerant of anything. And then we come along and we say, Jesus is the only way. And they go, well, that's evil, you're intolerant. And you go, wait a minute, you're not tolerant. It becomes a big contradiction. So tolerance is good so long as it's subordinated to all of these other principles. Right? So what, and in terms of the gospel, let's just say this in terms of the gospel. You have a lot of Christians that go out, I've seen this, mission statements of Christian ministries where they'll say, we are a Christian organization, but we don't proselytize. We are here to rescue people from human trafficking. And we will welcome anyone from any faith or sexual orientation that wants to help us, because our main goal is delivering people from human trafficking. So now you have a social cause. So whether it's feeding the poor or ministering to the poor or rescuing from human trafficking, they say these are noble goals. So therefore we'll put the gospel on hold in order to accomplish the greater good. The problem is, the gospel is the greater good. You can get somebody out of slavery, but if you don't give them the gospel, they're going to die out in the wilderness. Our goal is to bring them into the promised land, because the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because that's the only thing that can save anybody. But we've embraced, the spirit of the age says this to the church. It says, here's the message of the world to the church. Shut up and go feed the poor. The world loves it when we go feed the poor, but shut up with your intolerant message. And what we're saying is, but when we shut up, then we don't speak the words of life. And so, yes, we're going to minister to the poor, we're going to rescue from human trafficking, but we're going to make the gospel a priority. So when you get someone like a Rick Warren, and he says, hey, look, I'm going to join with Muslims, I'm going to join with Buddhists, anyone to feed the poor, I don't care. What ends up happening is you compromise the gospel. And I've seen it he joined with a mosque, and he said, we're working together for social projects. And then he said, in the statement that they put out, the Saddleback said, we've agreed with the mosque not to proselytize each other. And then after that came out, Warren denied it. He said, no, we never agreed to that. But it was his main pastor that was in charge of the whole thing that said, yes, we did. We agreed to that. And then the Muslim guy said, we never agreed to that. We never agreed that we're not going to try to win these Christians to become Muslims. So this is the danger, is that when we put the gospel second, we put social issues and tolerance first, we have to put the gospel first. So within this whole issue of Chrislam, I know I'm beating around the bush. People have accused Rick Warren of being Chrislam. No, Rick Warren is trying to reach out to Muslims. I just think that he does it wrong sometimes. I think that we need to always be unmovable, unshakable with regard to the gospel. And so there are lines that we can't cross. I used to minister to the poor, and you're constantly, when you're out there doing the stuff, you're always dealing with these issues. And I remember this weird New Age guy comes up to me, and he goes, Joel Richardson, I've heard about you. This is what he said. He said, the Spirit's told me about you. You're famous. And I was like, wow, cool. And he walks up, he goes, I have a gift for you. He says, hold out your hand. And I kind of went like this, and he puts this crystal in my hand, this big and he says how he did some ceremony. And I just sat there, and I went like this, and I said, you know something? I'm really grateful that you want to give me this gift, but I can't accept this. And he, as soon as I said that, he took it, and just this rage went over his face. And he said, "You know something? You know something?" And he just started yelling at me, and it was just like demonic manifestation. I couldn't receive that because I was essentially receiving the sort of witchcraft, voodoo nonsense that he was babbling on about. And I was saying, I appreciate your heart that you're saying you want to bless, but I can't receive what you're coming to offer. And so we're constantly having to dance fine lines and be careful. And sometimes a lot of these, leaders that are well-intentioned, I think they cross lines. So Rick Warren is not engaged in anything called Chrislam. He gets accused of that by some of the televangelists. It's not true. I think he means well. I think sometimes he just does it in ways that I don't personally think we should. Now, then you have a movement within the missions movement called the Insider Movement. This is where you have missionaries, again, Hudson Taylor is going to contextualize, but then they start going further, and they go, well, Daniel bowed with his head to the ground, therefore it's okay for me to bow and pray just like a Muslim. And so what they end up doing is they end up dressing like Muslims, they end up praying like Muslims, and using all of the religious language of Muslims, to where if a Muslim meets them, they'll actually say, "I'm a Muslim." And they'll say, because, the reason they'll defend it to us, they'll say, because to the Muslim, a Muslim only means one who is submitted to God. The problem is the Quran says a Muslim is one who is submitted to God and Muhammad. So I think that there's a problem there. And some of them will even say the Shahada. That's the creed of Islam. They'll say there's no God other than Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And they'll say that. And then they'll go into the mosques and bow and pray inside. And the argument is, well, because when you lead Muslims to the Lord, they're going to get killed, but we don't want to pull them out of their culture. We want to leave them in as missionaries. And look, I know that some people have to be secret Christians. I have secret Christian friends in Iran, but they don't go around pretending to be Muslims. I think when you do that, you are being false. You're being a stealth evangelist. You're being a deceptive evangelist. And so that, some people call that Chrislam. That actually is where we're starting to combine religions. And then you even have cases where some missionaries have eventually converted to Islam. And the wives call home and to the missions leaders and they say, "What am I going to do? I'm over here with 4 kids and my husband just converted to Islam because you guys taught him to embrace this methodology and he ended up becoming a Muslim." Then you actually have in China and in some African places, you actually have something that is properly called Chrislam. And that's where you have basically, if you were to go into their church, it would be like a charismatic church, prosperity gospel church, where they're preaching from the Quran and the Bible, praying for the sick, praying in tongues. It's this weird conglomeration. And of course, the pastor's rich. But they always end up compromising on Jesus and saying he's not God. Muhammad's a prophet. And so it's sort of this weird thing called Chrislam. But that's pretty rare compared to what a lot of people call Chrislam. So I know I just gave you a whole bunch of information, but that's probably a more thorough explanation.
Right here.
My question will reveal I'm not well versed in Islam. We know about the Sunni faction, the Shia faction.
Yeah.
Are there other factions? And would you think, if there are, would you think that the concept of the Antichrist coming from the Islamic world, would that be more possible one faction over another?
Okay, so are there other factions? Yeah, there's many different sort of sects and varieties. Among Shia, you've got some different varieties. You've got the Ismailis. They tend to be some of the most moderate. You've got the Sufis, and the Sufis are often Sunnis, but they're sort of mystical. They do the whirling dervish, kind of thing. You've got the Alawites and the Alevis. There's some different sects over there in Syria. Like Bashar Assad is an Alawite. So that's sort of a sect of Shia. And then you've got some that aren't even really Islamic anymore that are kind of like the Druze, but they probably have some connection to and a lot of Druze like in Israel and in Syria and so forth. But yes, there's a lot of different sects. I personally believe that the Antichrist would be a Sunni. the majority sect, the 85, 87%. When I first started, trying to make the Christian world a little bit more aware of Islamic eschatology, a lot of people said all this stuff about the Mahdi, and they go, only people that believe that are the Shia, the little minority sect. And I was like, that's not true. I'm reading all of these Sunni scholars that affirm belief in the Mahdi. But the Shia put more emphasis on it, and most people didn't know that a lot of the Sunnis believe. But if you go out and about and you're at a restaurant and your waiter's a Muslim and you go, and you start talking, I find that Muslims have a broad variety of opinion about the end times, just like Christians do. You go, you just go to your average Christian. What do you believe in, the return of Jesus? What do you believe about the rapture? I mean, you're going to get a million different opinions. And Muslims tend to be the same way. But Pew Research did a poll probably about 6 years ago now, and they asked a whole bunch of questions of Muslims in 23 different nations. And they said, do you believe the coming of the Mahdi is imminent in your lifetime? That's more than just do you believe in the Mahdi, do you believe his coming, his appearing will happen in your lifetime? And is interesting, the main countries that said yes, I think it was like 87%, Afghanistan. The second highest was Iraq. Just so happened the two countries that we've gone to war with, Messianic expectation is the highest there. The third was actually Turkey. It was like 67%. And a lot of people thought that the numbers would be down in like 10, 15%, but like a lot of countries were well over 50%. So what that means is this is widely held throughout the Islamic world, way more than most people realized, and end-time expectations are rampant throughout the Islamic world. A lot of these kids going over to join ISIS are going because they believe the prophecies are being fulfilled. Because their prophecies actually say a great war happens in Syria right before the coming of the Mahdi. And they're like, according to them, it's all coming into alignment. I kind of think this Russian thing has thrown a little bit of a wrench in the whole thing, because they're like, wait a minute, we thought the Romans were going to attack us, the West. And then Putin comes down, and they're like, that doesn't fit. But the point is, in the same way that in the 80s, under Hal Lindsey, all that, kind of like revival of expectations in the end times, that's happening in the Islamic world probably on an even greater level right now. When I first started doing a lot of research on this stuff, again, probably 14 years ago, every book in English that I could find, maybe, let's say there was 15, 20 books on the subject in English written by Muslims. Now I have like well over 50 books. So even just in the past 15 years, publication of books on the subject has exploded. And some of that is, just publication, translation, but it's definitely becoming big. I would tend to believe that he'll come out of the Sunni world, because that is the world, he needs the majority. And also just the prophets, the regions that they're pointing to that he comes from, I think it's pointing to Sunni majority nations. So.
Joel, why don't you go ahead and, because I know people probably would have this question, explain the difference, since the Sunnis and the Shias are the ones that are always in the news. Would you explain the difference between the two?
So again, the Shia were those that believed after Muhammad died that the successorship should go to his family members, should go to those that were from Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law, stepson. And so they became known as the partisans of Ali, the party of Ali, the Shia. And then on the other side, you have those that believed it should successorship should go to his companions, and they became known as the Sunnis. And again, they're the 85, 87% majority. The Shia are the 12, 13%. Now, the Shia are primarily in Iran, southern Iraq, so the capital, the city of Baghdad, and southern Iraq, as well as in Lebanon, Hezbollah, Lebanon, and Bahrain, up in Azerbaijan. Those are sort of the Shia strongholds. And then on the east coast of Saudi Arabia, a lot of the workers in the oil fields are Shia. Most of the other countries are Sunni majority. The difference, is if you were to observe them, the Shia have a lot more pomp and circumstance. Probably like Catholics. You know, they have icons of their imams that they pray through their imams to Allah. And if you were to go into some of the Shia areas, there's a lot of shrines where they'll go and pray to their sort of Muslim saints and so forth. And then within Sunnis, you know, you have many different sects as well, but you often, and this is probably worth mentioning, you have what the West will often refer to as Wahhabis. That's a term that goes back to Ibn al-Wahhab. He was an Islamist thinker and leader from Saudi Arabia. But the Wahhabis, call themselves Salafis. And basically what that means, Salafi is like purity. It's not just purity, it's like the foundation. And so the Salafis, what they are, they're sort of like Protestants. They're trying to get rid of the traditions of man. So they look at the Shia and they go, you guys have all this extra stuff. That's like idolatry, in the same way that we kind of look at the Catholic statues and all this stuff. And we go, you shouldn't be into all that. And so, you know, even it affects the way we do art in Protestantism. We don't have a lot of, you know, art in the sanctuary where, you know, the Catholic Church is going to have all these statues. You go into the Orthodox Church, you've got all the icons and so forth. The Salafis are always trying to purify. So in Saudi Arabia, they're getting rid of graveyards, they're getting rid of shrines, they're trying to do away with what they call bid'ah, which is innovation, the traditions of men. And they're trying to get back to the book, if you will, back to the path of Muhammad. And they tend to be the most devout, and those are ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all of those guys. They tend to be the ones that know the book better than a lot of the other ones. So that's a very brief kind of overview.
We're going to take 2 more questions, okay? All right. Let me get one back here, and then I'm going to get you, Mark, right here. I'll take 3 more questions. I'll get you in here, brother. Here you go.
Could you tell us what you think about books that are coming out that Jesus is revealing himself to the Muslims through dreams and visions?
You know, I know a lot of Muslims that have had that experience. I work with, so you're all familiar with Saeed Abedini. He's the American Iranian that's been in prison, right, for some years now. Well, I mean, is this being recorded? Is this going out? Yes. It is? Okay, so I won't say too much, but I work with, you know, I work with the underground church in Iran. I'll just say that. And this one story, I love this story. And this is a good, close friend of mine. I mean, a close, dear, dear friend. And they heard about a believer that was out in the rural area. And there was no house church near him. There was no, you know, underground church near him. And yet he was getting reports that this guy was like a devout, he got saved. And so they said, we got to go check this out. And so they went, they drove out, and he like, this guy, he goes, you can't believe, like, this guy lived in this little teeny room with nothing. Like, he was like the poorest, uneducated, destitute guy you can imagine. And we came and we visited with him, and he was clearly a Christian. And we said, well, what happened? And he said, well, I believed what the man told me. And he goes, what man? What are you talking about? And he says, well, for like 40 nights, this man would come to my door at night, and he would knock on the door, and I'd open the door, and he had long hair, and he was in all white, and he had this just powerful, like, radiant presence. And he would ask if he could come in, and I invited him in, and he told me, he said, write down what I tell you. And for 40 nights he came, and he would tell me to write down, and I wrote everything down. He said, and I just believed what he told me. And my buddy said, well, can I see what he told you? And so the guy goes and he gets this journal, and in Persian script, all handwritten, he takes it and he looks at it, and it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. The entire Gospel of John verbatim. And so these stories are happening throughout the Islamic world. Now, let me just emphasize this. More Muslims are coming to faith because Christians are sharing the gospel. So sort of in the charismatic world, the Pentecostal charismatic world, they get all excited like, yes, Jesus is doing this. And then it's like sort of like Muslims only get saved when they have 3 visions, 2 dreams, and a personal appearance. But the overwhelming majority of Muslims that are getting saved is because someone had the boldness and the love to share the gospel with them. But there are many that are, there's a lot, there's stories. I'll tell you another one. I was in Egypt 2 years ago, the summer of 2013, and I tell this story a lot because the church that I was with, they were so excited when this happened because it just happened the week that I was there. And so in Egypt, a lot of the Christian women, the past 20 years, there's been a lot of Christian women get kidnapped, and they'll force them to convert to Islam. There's just a whole bunch of mess that goes with that, blackmailing them and shaming them and so forth, and abusing them. And so this young Christian girl got into a taxi, and the taxi driver was a Salafi. And so she was a little bit nervous, and she felt Jesus nudging her, saying, I want you to tell him that I love him. And she was kind of feeling this urge, and she was just like, no way, that's just crazy. And it wouldn't let go of her. And so finally she said, okay, look. She said, I'm going to ask him to take me to a crowded area so that he can't kidnap me. And she said, I'm going to get out of the car first. I'm going to give him the money, and I'm just going to say, Yeshua loves you, and kind of hightail it. And then she felt like the Lord kind of like saying, okay, deal. And so she said to the guy, she said, take me to this crowded area, and she did that. She got out of the cab. She gave him the money. She said, Yeshua loves you. And he said, what did you just say? She said, Yeshua loves you. And he said, I need to talk to you. And he said, the past couple weeks, or the past week or so, and she said he used the name Isa, which is the name for Jesus in the Quran. It's an improper name. And he says, Isa has been appearing to me in dreams, and he's been saying all these things to me. He says, but he tells me things that go against the Quran. He specifically said, he's been telling me all this stuff that goes against the Quran. He said, so I've just been disregarding it as a dream. He said, but last night he came to me again, and very powerfully he looked at me and he said, so that you will know that it is I that have been speaking to you, tomorrow a young Christian girl will get into your taxi. She'll have you take her to the place. She'll get out of the taxi. She will hand you the money, and she will tell you that I love you. And so, and I hear stories like this, and the real reason I've told these 2 stories is because I know the people that it happened to. And I hate evangelistic exaggeration. Jesus doesn't need our stories. But I've followed up with my friends in Egypt, and this Salafi man has been baptized, and he is now part of the community there. So, it's happening. Amen, right? There's amazing things that are happening. But I just want to emphasize that we don't go, oh, well, Jesus is doing it, so we don't have to. Most of them get saved and whenever he does that, he brings Christians into their life. It's not like, well, I guess even this guy out in the rural, that's probably like, it's almost unbiblical because it says, how will they hear without a preacher, right? Like he's not just out saving everybody by himself. He wants us to be about the business of doing it. But every time it happens, he usually brings Christians into their life right away. Or there's a Christian radio broadcast or something. But all that to say is we need to be about the business of preaching. But he's doing it. There's just too many stories to say he's not. Yeah, what's the final chapter of Acts? 29. So all right, so this is 29.
As we've, the last several months, been through all this drama relative to the nuclear agreement with Iran. We're all sick of that. But anyhow, it brings to mind the thought of some of the reading I've had where I understand that there are, maybe particularly with the Shiites, that they believe they're obligated to bring forth some kind of terrible trauma, whatever it might be, to hurry the reappearance of the Mahdi or the 12th Imam. Is that correct in my belief that they believe that?
Well, so the hot wiring, the apocalypse theory. So here's the thing, is you'll hear this a lot, and you'll hear even some well-known Christian voices saying this. It's not entirely true. this is a problem within apocalyptic movements throughout history. When Judas betrayed Jesus, it's speculated that he was trying to force Jesus to take his throne as king, that he was trying to force the hand of God. And there's often movements that think they can do that, force the hand of God, hotwire the apocalypse, because they want to see God bring about redemption. And then there's others that just sit back, like the Jews in New York City that spit on the Israeli flag because they say, you're not supposed to do it, you're supposed to let God do it. So there's some that think they can force the hand of God, there's some that think they shouldn't do anything. And then there's others that think they participate, with God and bringing about, redemption or whatever. But so it's the same in Christianity and Islam and Judaism. So now with regard to this thing in Iran, when Ahmadinejad came into power, he was said to be a disciple of this particular Islamic preacher named Mesbah Yazdi. And he was a bad dude. They called him the alligator. And it was speculated within Iran that this guy may be a member of this secret organization called Hojatiyah. None of this matters. I shouldn't even give you the names. But Hojatiyah, it's speculated, believe this, that they can hotwire the apocalypse. So therefore, some within Iran said, could Ahmadinejad believe this? Most of them don't. Some fairly well-known authorities, Christian end-time teachers, have been saying openly, it is a fact, that Iran wants to initiate global chaos to usher in the Mahdi. I don't believe that. I actually don't believe that because the evidence isn't there. If you really read their stuff, it could be, there could be some within the government that believe that, but it doesn't seem to be the consensus. If anything, it's actually a secret sect. The Hojati is a secret sect, and some speculated that Ahmadinejad could have been influenced by that, that they would literally just launch a nuclear war. Now here's the thing. Iran has openly said they want to wipe out Israel. So forget, speculation. They said they want to do that, and they're working to do that through Hezbollah and various proxies. So we don't need to guess that they want to do that. The Iranian leaders are apocalyptic whack jobs. So, if you were to, if there was some news reporter that came in here, they would be like, Stuart Heights had Joel Richardson in. He wrote Islamic Antichrist. He's an apocalyptic wacko. But, and that may or may not be the case, but the leaders of Iran are 1,000 times more crazy than I am. And we just gave them an open door to have nuclear weapons. That's crazy. That makes no sense whatsoever, especially when they're openly saying we want to wipe out your best friend down the street. There's no way that you can justify that as making any real sense. I've heard all the explanations and they all fall short. And then on the ground, everything, all the agreements that said would happen, none of them, they're all falling through. And the only one that's keeping his word is our president, which is not a good thing. But so anyway, I hope that answer. I didn't mention any of the names, but when I was on Glenn Beck, when he was back on Fox News, this was his thing. He said, because he had added on some previous Christian voices that said that. And he's like, Iran wants to do this. And I'm like, when you're on live TV, you don't want to argue with the host, but it's kind of like, but that, and I hate to say it, but the right sometimes pushes that narrative. They want to, as soon as they get a nuke, they're going to do it because they think that's going to usher in the Messiah. That's not the case. They don't necessarily think they can force God's hand. They think there is, all of these wars in the Middle East right now, here's what's interesting, and I don't want to lose you here, but their prophecies, whether Sunni or Shia, say there's going to be this great war in the Middle East that ends up in Syria, and this is the war that leads to the coming of the Mahdi. Now, before the Mahdi comes, there's sort of this bad guy called the Sufyani. Okay, and they say once the Sufyani has this big war and then he gets wiped out, then the Mahdi comes. Well, the Shia from Iran, they think Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, is the Sufyani. All of the Sunnis think that Assad is the Sufyani. You can go on the Islamic forums online and read. They don't all believe this, but it's really widely held. And I actually asked this guy in Turkey, Adnan Oktar, he's this weird Muslim cult leader, if he believes that Assad is the Sufyani. And he said, oh yes, we know he's the Sufyani. So they think as soon as, the ISIS guys think it's their divine prophesied job to take out Assad, and then that's going to usher in the Mahdi. And then the Sunnis, the Shia in Iran think they have to take out Baghdadi. And so they think they're right at the door. And so there is a degree to where they think they can do some of these things, but that's because there's war and, so we live in interesting times, for sure.
Here's the last question.
Joel, I know one of the issues that we deal with as Americans and then as Christians is we're kind of in conflict on issues. I'm going to assume everyone in here is a Christian and everyone in here is an American. So how do you reconcile some of the challenges that we have and struggles we have being both? And I know our citizenship is of heaven, but we're here on earth. And so as we see things like refugees that are flooding our borders and a government that's bringing more refugees into our nation, many of them that are Islamic, many of them are threatening us, and yet we know we are to reach out to unbelievers. So tell us from your perspective, how do we reconcile those two things where we're trying to secure our country and the security of our relatives and friends versus evangelizing the unbeliever?
Yeah, well, fantastic question, and it's one of the very difficult questions of this hour. So I believe that in an ideal world, we would greatly diminish Islamic immigration. I think that's wisdom. Now, the problem is that in the Islamic world, there's so many different things I could say, and I don't want to ramble too much, but in the Islamic world, many people will say they're Muslim even if they've become an atheist. Even if they've rejected Islam, culturally, they'll still call themselves a Muslim. Or they could be real moderates, and they're trying to flee radicalism, come to the United States. So when we say no to immigration, all Muslim immigration, how do you do that? How do you do that? Do you say no immigration from Muslim-majority nations? Well, then Christians are going to be persecuted over there. And you don't allow the Christians from Muslim-majority nations, many of whom are fleeing to seek refuge. So you can't just do it based on nation. And if you just wholesale say no Muslim immigration, you end up actually forcing many of the moderates and the forward thinkers that can bring a degree of reformation to portions of the Islamic world. You block them from coming. And so as much as I think in general it would be wise to diminish or to stop it, I honestly don't know how you do it. Because there's missiologists, missionaries who are wrestling through a lot of these complicated issues have a hard time doing it. The government's not going to do a better job. And they're so politically correct that they're not going to do it anyway. And so, first of all, there's that issue. I think politically, it would be wise, but I don't personally have any confidence that we're ever going to do that. And so sometimes there's a degree, and I hate to be hokey, but to where we just have to say the serenity prayer, which is, God, give me, the courage to change the things I can, and when I can't change something, to know that, the wisdom to know the difference, like patience when I can't change. And to a degree, the bottom line is, I believe we need to be politically active. There's no question about that. But there's a degree to which when it's already a done deal, here's what I see a lot of Christians do, is we waste a lot of time griping and complaining and not doing what we should be doing. Like, we can rail that they're coming, but they're here. They're coming. And if you're in Europe, whether you like it or not, I think it would be wise to try to block this massive flow coming out of the Middle East into Europe. I think we should try to work out deals with Saudi Arabia and some of the other nations, the wealthy ones in particular. Jordan has like 1.5 million. Lebanon has like 1.5 million. Their economies are about to implode because they've taken in so many. Turkey has like 2 million. I was just there. They're everywhere in the streets. We're talking about, we're freaking about 10,000. Can we have a couple million? But they're pouring into Europe. I think it's going to be a big problem. And there's no question. We're not naive. Yes, there's going to be terrorists among them. But the bottom line is they're there. They're there. And so we as the church need to be about the business of sharing the gospel any which way we can. We need to be meeting them at the gates and being the first faith. Because when they first come in, those first 3 months are some of the most important, critical time periods. And so I was talking to Pastor on the way over here. There's a dynamic that happens when second generation immigrants, we now call them third culture Muslims, third culture immigrants. What happens is, let's say some parents, and there's so many other factors, like many of them coming are Kurds. So the Kurds are being persecuted throughout the Islamic world. They come into Turkey, and then they get attacked by the government, and they're like, we're not even safe in Turkey. And many of them, they're Muslim, but many of them are Kurds, some of the more moderate Muslims in the world. And so it's so hard. But when you read like a lot of the right-wing websites, it's like, they're all terrorists. They're all young men of military age. And you're like, well, of course they are. They just marched like 1,200 miles. And of course the majority are, because like 70% are men. And of course a much smaller percentage are women and children. And I'm sure that some of them are terrorists, but it's not like 70% are all ISIS. It's like the right can sometimes just latch on to some internet article and send it around the email chain and just freak out. Now, on the other hand, if Christians meet them at the gates and they say, hey, we're sorry for all that you've gone through. We want to get to know you. Would you come to our house? Could we eat dinner with you? Can I help bring you up to the office so you can get some of your paperwork filed? Because again, the bottom line is they're here. Can I minister to you? Could I give you a Bible? Can I pray for you? What's going on? And then this kid turns 15, and some kids at mosque saying, we need to blow up these infidels. And he goes, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but you know something? Pat and Sue, when I moved here, we used to go over to their house for dinner. He used to give me a ride to soccer practice, and we still have their Bible, and I really like Pat and Sue. You know what I'm saying? Like, we are the ones that have the church is the only one that can make a difference. And ideally, if we lead some of them to the Lord, because the bottom line is, and let's just say this too, my friend from Iran, he says Ayatollah Khomeini, the Iranian Revolution, 1979, he says he was one of the greatest evangelists in recent world history. You go, wait a minute, Ayatollah Khomeini? Yes. And then he says, because he revealed the true face of Islam to the Iranian people. And now it's a generation later, and they've rejected it. And now we have the fastest growing church in the world in Iran. Because when the human heart sees real Islam, it hates it. It hates it. And what Ayatollah Khomeini did for Iran, I'm convinced ISIS, in 5 years down the road, we will look back and say ISIS did that for much of the Middle East. The Isaiah 19 says there's going to be a revival in the Middle East. Satan moved in his armies, he moved in his hordes, but it backfires. And by moving in his hordes, I believe that's actually going to lead to revival. So many of these Muslims fleeing, yes, there's probably some terrorists among them, but many of them have seen the true face of Islam. I sat in this little camper with these guys. One's a Shia, one's a Sunni, as they're just puffing away. And they're like, Islam, it's all the same. They didn't even hardly know the difference. And this one guy, the Shia, told me when he was in Mosul, and ISIS came, and they weren't even Arabs. They were Pakistanis, and they had a translator. And they asked him all these questions. Are you Sunni? And he lied, and he said he was Sunni, because if he said he was Shia, they would have executed him right there. And so they said, like, they asked him the question, like, how do you pray? Do you turn to the right and to the left? And he answered all the questions properly, and they said, okay. He seemed to be a Sunni, and then they left. The guy packed up his car, packed up his family into the car, all of his life possessions, and he started driving out of Mosul. And they stopped him, and they said, your car keys or your son? You choose which one you want to give to us. And he handed him the car keys and walked out of the city that he's only city he's ever known, with his family and nothing. He's living in a little camper, and his little girl has, what do you call it when you're coughing up blood from sleeping out, tuberculosis. Yeah, and here he is sitting there, and he's just shaking his head. You think these people aren't disgusted by what they've seen? And I say, and a Christian comes along and sits down and says, man, I'm sorry, can I pray for you? The harvest is wide open right now. It really is. And if we miss this opportunity because we're angry about immigration, It's a problem. It is a problem. But we need to be, I think, gospel people first. And Americans, I don't want to say Americans second, but yes, Americans second. We need to be Christians first and think about the gospel first and foremost. Because ultimately, the job of the government is to protect its citizens. The job of the Christian is to think about how they can lay down their lives to lead others to the Lord. Our job is not primarily about self-preservation. And it's natural to protect your children and your country, and I understand that, and I'm the same way. You know, if someone's kicking my door in, I'm gonna kill the wolf. But it's a reality that we have to wrestle with, which is, but are we truly being ambassadors of Jesus, or are we being patriots first? Because sometimes there's a difference. So I hope that it's a tough. I mean, there's a lot of tough things that we have to wrestle through. So
Thank you, Joel.
all right.